please be seated and tell us your name, spell your last name once you're comfortably seated.
Hi, my name is Dr. Stephen Sina, C-I-N-A.
Your witness.
Thank you, Your Honor. Dr. Sina, can you explain to the jury what you do for a living?
I'm a contracted forensic pathologist for the Adams County Coroner's Office, so I do most of their autopsies.
What sort of information do forensic pathologists rely upon to make their determinations?
It depends on the nature of the case. At Adams County, the investigators put together a narrative, a story for me before I start my autopsy, and sometimes information comes from family members, sometimes from doctors or medical records, sometimes from the police. Once they have that story together, I look at that and then decide how I'm going to approach my autopsy.
In addition to those materials like reports from police or from family, do you sometimes also rely upon videos or other footage of incidents that happened to the decedent?
Yes, often after the initial information, we get supplemental information. So, for example, a case like an in-custody death, I want to see every amount of video that's available to me before I make a decision, plus any additional records or witness statements.
In complex or important cases, do you sometimes also consult with other doctors or other specialists to reach your conclusions?
On occasion.
Why is it sometimes important to have that additional information, whether it's the reports, the video, or those consultations?
Sometimes without having witness statements, medical history, video evidence, it can be difficult to determine the cause or manner of death in some cases.
When you're provided with new information or you can evaluate new information, can that change your opinion on what happens to the person who died?
Yes, there's even a disclaimer to that effect on the front of the autopsy report saying uh, this cause of death and manner of death are based upon what we know right now, but that can change with additional information.
Well, thanks for telling us a little bit about forensic pathology as a discipline. Now, could you tell the jury a little bit about yourself? How about your formal education?
I received my BA in Natural Sciences from the Johns Hopkins University in 1988, my MD from Vanderbilt University School of Medicine in 1992. I then did 3 years of anatomic pathology residency training in Charleston, South Carolina, where I also served as a deputy coroner. I then did a year of surgical pathology subspecialty fellowship at the Johns Hopkins Hospital, followed by a year of subspecialty fellowship training at the Office of the Chief Medical Examiner for the state of Maryland.
How did you end up here in Colorado?
After I served 4 years active duty in the Air Force as a regional medical examiner and staff pathologist in San Antonio, Texas, my 4-year commitment was up, so I initially moved here in 2001.
Have you been here ever since?
No, I lived here from 2001 to late 2006. Starting at the beginning of 2007, I was Deputy Chief Medical Examiner for Broward County, Florida, which is Fort Lauderdale. I did that for about 4.5 years, then spent a year as the Chief Administrative Officer at the University of Miami Tissue Bank, trying to get medical examiners in Florida to donate more tissues from their patients. And then from 2012 to 2016, I was the Chief Medical Examiner in Chicago.
And then when did you come back to Colorado again and take up your work with Adams County that you do now?
I started up with Adams again June of 2016 and have been with them since.
Do you hold any board certifications that are relevant?
I'm board certified in anatomic and forensic pathology.
Can you explain to the jury, please, what the role of a forensic pathologist is in a case like this?
Well, our most advertised function that you'd see on TV is we do the autopsies and determine the cause and manner of death. In some jurisdictions, we also do death scene investigation. I don't do that here. They have investigators for that. We interpret toxicological analysis, and we can comment on mechanisms of injury.
You mentioned the thing that you get tied to most often on TV is autopsies. Are there any common misconceptions that come across in the TV or news?
Many I have a whole lecture on.
Can you give me one or two top hits?
Sure. Medical examiner goes to a death scene, looks at the body and pokes around a little bit and says, looks like time of death was between 11:42 and 11:48 last night. Well, that guy should be arrested. The only way to know that is if he did it and looked at his watch. We can't do that.
It sounds like you have as many frustrations with medical shows as I have with legal ones.
Probably so.
Now, what is the role of the forensic pathologist in the justice system? What do you do?
Well, Our autopsy findings are often useful in medical legal proceedings such as trials. So our role at this point is to try to explain any kind of medical terminology or things that we're seeing in terms that will educate the jury so they can make an informed decision when it comes to deciding if someone's guilty or not.
And you mentioned giving information to the jury to decide whether somebody is guilty or not guilty. Is it the role of the forensic pathologist to say somebody is guilty or not guilty?
No, that's the jury's role.
Okay. Do you provide them, though, with some medical insights that they can use as part of their determinations?
Hopefully, if I'm doing my job correctly.
I appreciate that, Dr. Sina. Now, can you explain to the jury what the difference is between your role as a forensic pathologist and a coroner?
Sure. Colorado is predominantly a coroner state, although in Denver and I believe Colorado Springs, they have coroners/medical examiners. Adams County is covered by a coroner who's an elected official, and then she contracts with me to do the autopsies.
In Adams County, is the coroner a doctor?
She's not. She's a medical legal death investigator by training.
Okay. And so is she the one who ultimately signs off on things?
Well, I mean, I've got, she lets me have full control on cause of death. Technically, in Colorado, she can determine manner of death, but basically what I say she agrees with. We've not had a disagreement in the 7 years I've worked there.
All right, I appreciate that. Can you talk to me and the jury a little bit about general practices in conducting an autopsy? Are there some pretty widely accepted general techniques that you use?
Sure. General protocol would be, first of all, find out what the case is about by reading the narrative. Then we would examine the external features of the body for clothing, evidence of medical intervention, collection of trace evidence if the police ask us to do that. Following that, once the body's unclothed, we'll document general external features, hair color, eye color, tattoos, things of that nature. After we do that, we'll document any evidence of external injury. Then we draw fluid for toxicological analysis. Following that, we do a complete internal examination to look for any evidence of injury or disease on the inside of the body.
As part of the process of conducting an autopsy, documenting what you're doing while you're doing it?
Yes, as I go, I document what I see with body diagrams, and our staff will document with photographs.
Okay. Why is it important to have those diagrams and those photos?
Well, without the diagrams, it'd be very difficult to remember all the details for when I dictate the case the next day.
Okay. Is it also important so that other people can peer review your work or evaluate it independently?
That could be another use of the diagrams in the autopsy report.
Did you also take, do you also often take blood or tissue samples during the autopsy?
Yes.
Why is that important to take those samples?
Well, the blood samples are used for toxicological analysis. In someone who's been hospitalized, we try to get the admission blood samples because that's going to be more reflective of what was going on in the blood at the time of the incident, which we're able to get in this case. Most of our cases, my people don't die in the hospital, so I draw postmortem blood on them to run toxicology. The tissue samples, we take those for microscopic analysis to see if there's any kind of subtle disease process. We also save the larger chunks of tissue in case we need to make more slides later on.
Is Adams County a jurisdiction where the autopsies are done with peer review from others, or is it just you?
I don't know if the coroner has a peer review process. Since leaving Chicago, I've stayed strictly away from any administrative duties.
It's probably wise. Is that the same thing that you do in your consulting business to stay away from the administrative side of things?
Well, I do consult with lawyers across the country on civil cases, predominantly medical malpractice, wrongful death. And I've let my wife, who has the MBA, deal with all the lawyers in the billing, so I don't want any part of that.
Seems wise. Now, did you follow these generally accepted practices in conducting and documenting your autopsy, in this case involving Elijah McClain?
I did.
Your Honor, at this time, the people would tender Dr. Sina as an expert in forensic pathology.
Any objection or voir dire?
Objection, Your Honor.
All right, the court will allow Dr. Sina to explain and opine in the area of forensic pathology.
So, Dr. Sina, I'd like to start with sort of an overview of the autopsy circumstances in this case. Were you the one who performed the the autopsy on Elijah McClain?
Yes, on September 3rd, 2019 at 10 o'clock.
So you mentioned the autopsy was on September 3rd. What day did Mr. McClain die?
August 27th.
Okay. And where was he when he originally died?
I believe in the hospital. I forget which one.
Okay. Does the University of Colorado Hospital sound right?
That's where many of my patients come from.
Okay. Is that hospital in Adams County?
I believe so.
When you did the autopsy, were there representatives from the Aurora Police Department in the room viewing the autopsy?
Yes, there were.
Was there a detective from the APD there?
My report says there were 2 representatives. It's not unusual to have a detective and a CSI, someone who collects evidence.
Okay. A CSI, crime scene investigator?
Correct.
Did the APD also provide you some reports or summary information about what they believed had occurred to Mr. McClain?
Most of the information I got initially was from our investigator's narrative. I believe additional information came to light later, and a lot more information came to light 2 years later.
Okay. Now, when you say your investigator prepared a summary, is that sort of a written document that the investigator prepares based on whatever they were told?
Correct, based on what they know by the time I'm going to start my autopsy.
Did you request additional information at the time of the autopsy from the Aurora Police Department?
I likely requested all video that was available and any witness statements, which would sort of be standard for me in this type of case.
Okay. Generally speaking, though, is it a bit unusual for you to need or think that you need that sort of follow-up material?
Most cases are very straightforward, and I don't need all that much follow-up material.
Okay. So it was a bit unusual in this case?
Deaths in custody are always high profile, so I always try to get all the information possible.
Was one of the things that you requested from the Aurora Police Department all of the body camera footage related to the incident?
Yes, I believe so.
Did the Aurora Police Department provide that to you at the time of the autopsy?
Um, I got some video evidence prior to signing out my initial report back in 2019. I got additional video footage prior to my amended report in 2021.
Okay. So when you asked the APD for the body camera footage, they provided you, what, about 10 minutes of footage?
I know we had a meeting before I finalized the first report, and I believe the meeting went about half hour, 40 minutes. I'm not sure how much of that was footage time.
Okay. Now, after seeing that initial piece of footage from the Aurora Police Department, you asked for additional footage at the time of the autopsy and before your original report in this case, right?
I would have asked for all the video that was available at the time of autopsy and before I finalized the case, but I was not provided all the video before I finalized the first autopsy.
Okay. And in fact, you didn't get the rest of that video until a year and a half, 2 years later?
About that time frame when there was other proceeding.
And that was when Dr. Mitchell and our office became involved, right?
Yes, right around there.
Did that initial shortage of information, especially not having access to the video, impact your ability to accurately evaluate what had happened to Mr. McClain?
Yes, it did.
Why is that?
Well, in the second set of footage, I can see very clearly that he was given an injection of ketamine. Within a minute or two, he's in agonal breathing. He's actively dying. And shortly thereafter, he goes into cardiac arrest. I didn't have that temporal relationship on video before, so I couldn't tell you how close together his agonal breathing was with that shot. But once I saw the video, shot came, and then he's in agonal breathing, made a temporal relationship, which allowed me, instead of saying undetermined for the cause of death, to say the cause of death was complications of ketamine administration following forcible restraint.
So is it correct to say that the initial video that you were provided by the Aurora Police Department didn't include the footage of the ketamine injection?
And that's correct. I didn't have that part of it.
Did it also not include the period where Mr. McClain was being restrained right before and after the ketamine injection?
Some of the videos did include restraint, but that was about 2,000 autopsies ago, so I don't remember all the details of what the initial video showed.
Is it normal in your experience, for when you ask somebody like the APD to provide you this additional material footage, that they don't do it?
It varies from jurisdiction to jurisdiction. Some jurisdictions, it's easier to get information from, others, it's more difficult.
I mean, it's not just that it varies from jurisdiction to jurisdiction. This is exactly backwards of any other place you've worked, isn't it?
Your Honor, argument.
Rephrase.
Dr. Sina, you've previously said, quote, "This is exactly backwards of any other place I have worked." That's your own way to describe this, isn't it?
If I said that in a previous proceeding, then I said that.
Well, let's be sure. Could we please show the witness his 2021 testimony, page 44? And I'll direct your attention, sir, to lines 5 through 13.
Yes, that's what I said in response to asking for the witness statement and all the body camera footage. I was told that I could get that after I saw my report, which is backwards.
Okay. And after you signed your initial, hold on. The APD told you that they wouldn't give you this evidence until after you determined the cause of death?
Like I said, I don't remember the conversation, but it was fresher in my mind then. So they must have said that.
Okay. And even after you did that original opinion and original autopsy report, they still didn't give it to you, did they?
I didn't receive anything till a proceeding began around 2021.
Okay. And that was that proceeding that you were working with Dr. Mitchell and folks from our office?
That's correct.
That original first report that you published, was that published on November 7th of 2019?
Your Honor, may I refer to my report?
You may.
Correct, November 7th, 2019.
And at that point in time, based on the limited information you had, what was your conclusion as to the cause of death?
I didn't have a cause of death. It was undetermined, and I raised several possibilities, in my opinion, but there was nothing I could put my finger on. No injury or disease or an outright overdose that I could say was the cause of death.
Okay. So that was November 2019. Time goes by until the 2021 work that we were just talking about. Were you provided with new information to evaluate Mr. McClain's death?
Yes, I was provided with witness statements and all the body footage I had asked for.
Okay. Was that when Dr. Mitchell became involved?
I don't know. I didn't involve Dr. Mitchell.
Well, you did meet with him, though.
I did meet with him. He wanted to go through the leftover tissue that we had in the office to make some slides.
Okay. So you had him over to the office to microscopically inspect some of the samples that you took?
I didn't arrange for him to come to the office, but as a courtesy, I met him at the office and showed him where the stock jar was and helped him to take his samples from which he made his slides.
And Dr. Mitchell is another forensic pathologist like yourself?
Correct, from the East Coast.
Okay. You know him professionally?
I do.
I assume mutual professional respect between the two of you?
Yes.
You're aware that he's been a leader in getting the National Association of Medical Examiners to adopt guidelines regarding in-custody deaths like this one?
He was the chair of the committee that wrote guidelines for deaths in custody.
Now, the additional information that you received, you indicated that you reviewed about 30 minutes of body-worn camera footage. Is that correct?
Initially, most likely somewhere in that time range. Subsequently, I believe it was several hours.
Now, sir, do you remember that 2021 statement that you made?
Probably not.
Well, let's show to the witness, please, the 2021 statement, page 52. And I'm referring you to lines 16 to 21, where you state, "The footage I saw initially was maybe in the 10-minute range, and I probably have seen triple that since then." So it was basically, I believe, the very initial part of the encounter, where in fact body cam footage was knocked off. It was pretty useless, and then maybe a little bit after that. So initially you got about 10 minutes of footage from the APD?
That was my recollection at that time.
Okay. And then subsequently, you've seen about 30 minutes of it.
It felt like much longer.
The jury can probably sympathize with that. Now, after you'd had an opportunity to view all this additional evidence, did you prepare an amended autopsy report in this case?
I did.
Is that the best practice when you get new information?
Um, I believe if you have new information that substantially changes the cause and manner of death, yes, that's the best practice to amend it.
Whose decision was it to issue an amended autopsy report in this case?
The coroner and I.
Oh, were you forced to or pressured to?
No, I just believed it was the right thing to do, being that I now had a cause of death.
So I want to talk about some of the findings of that amended report. When was that put together? 2021?
Yes.
The first one of those findings in that amended report I want to talk to you about is how, if at all, did this additional material you got affect your opinion regarding whether Mr. McClain was suffering from excited delirium on the night that he was killed?
In the first report where I said the cause of death was undetermined, I discussed excited delirium and ruled it out. So he didn't suffer from excited delirium.
Why is that?
Well, first of all, the National Association of Medical Examiners decided a few months ago we're not allowed to use that term. In 2021, it was a valid term. It was reported in some of the witness statements that he showed increased strength for his size, that he was acting erratically, and that he needed to be restrained. I've seen people with excited delirium with those symptoms, but usually they also have a high fever and they have a stimulant drug on board like methamphetamine or cocaine. He had no methamphetamine, he had no cocaine, he had no documented fever. Ergo, I can't say he had excited delirium.
Now, when you say initial reports about how Mr. McClain was acting strangely, are you referring to the Aurora Police Department's descriptions of how he was acting?
Most likely, yes.
But then when you compared those descriptions to actual footage, so for example, from the Shell station where Mr. McClain was buying drinks, and then the body cam footage, you didn't see those signs, did you?
Right. I would say he did not show signs of excited delirium while he was in the store or while he was walking down the street.
Now, we mentioned your determination that Mr. McClain didn't have excited delirium. I want to talk about another opinion that you offered in your amended report regarding Mr. McClain's arteries. In your amended report with the additional information you had available to you, were you able to rule out that any problem with the coronary artery contributed to his death?
In the initial report, I mentioned that he had a small, one of the coronary arteries was small, about 1 millimeter across, whereas it should have been 2 to 3 millimeters for his size. I mentioned that because I did not have a cause of death at that time, and that can put a strain on your heart if you have a small coronary artery. Subsequent to that initial report, I learned that he was a distance runner, which to me means that this guy, if he can run 5 miles with that small coronary artery, he's obviously got good collateral circulation. So although I raised it as a possibility when I didn't have a cause of death, when I did have the new information and had a cause of death, I believe that became irrelevant.
That narrow coronary artery that you saw, do you have any medical belief as to how long Mr. McClain had likely had that?
I bet he was born with it and had little small arterioles from the other coronary arteries filling up the space it should have.
Are there other arteries that can supply blood, that collateral circulation to the heart?
Sure. I mean, you have the left main, which has the left anterior descending coronary artery and the first diagonal and the left circumflex. Then you have the right coronary that leads to the right posterior descending. So all of those can interweave and supply bloods to part of the heart where they don't normally supply blood to.
And please correct me if I'm in any way misstating this, but at least from a non-doctor perspective, what I'm hearing you say is there's this birth narrow coronary artery, but that since you know he's an active runner, it's likely that the other arteries were compensating for it, that the collateral circulation was still good and strong?
I would say that's the most likely scenario.
I'd like to talk a little bit about some of the specimens and evidence that you examined during the course of preparing your amended autopsy report. So if you want to double check what we're talking about. It's on page 7 of the report there. One of the first samples that you obtained was the sample of admission blood, donor blood, peripheral blood, and other vitreous fluids. Can you explain to the jury what that is?
Sure, admission blood would be the first blood sample from the hospital that we were available to get. I believe the one we got was after he'd been in the hospital 20, 30 minutes, somewhere in there. Donor blood, he was an organ donor, and the donation people will draw tubes of blood for us before they do the donation. So we have something to work on with toxicology. I was also able to get a little bit of peripheral blood out of him, subclavian blood, which is my preferred testing blood. It's better than heart blood because heart blood can have some redistribution. But I didn't use the peripheral blood in this case because that would only show what he got in the hospital. It wouldn't show what he came into the hospital with. So the admission blood was more important. Then the vitreous fluid is fluid from the eyeball, which we take as a matter of routine, but we can use it for electrolyte analysis, glucose, things of that nature. But once again, that vitreous fluid wouldn't reflect the status of his vitreous fluid in his eye when he was admitted several days prior. So I didn't see the need for that.
You mentioned that the admission blood is particularly important. Can you describe to the jury what admission blood is?
When you come into the hospital in an emergent state, it's not unusual for them to draw several tubes of blood on you real quick to, test your white blood cell count and your blood chemistries and perhaps transfusion match. So any leftover blood from that initial admission is what we try to get to run in these kind of cases.
And you mentioned the admission blood in this case was from only 20 or 30 minutes after Mr. McClain's arrival at the hospital. Do you know that because they label the tubes and stamp them with the time they take it?
Yes, I believe they do.
Is that a pretty common practice in your experience to receive those sorts of samples from a place like UC Health?
UC Health is pretty good at that. Some of the other places sort of hit or miss.
Why is having the admission blood important for a toxicological or like chemicals in the blood screen of Mr. McClain?
Well, let's say theoretically, which he was not, let's say he had been on cocaine at the time of this incident. That would show up in the admission blood. That would not show up in the blood that I took at autopsy several days later because it would have been metabolized away. So the admission blood is more reflective of the substances in his blood that were present at the time of the incident leading to his hospitalization.
So I assume from what you've been saying here that the coroner's office sent that admission blood off to a lab for testing to screen for different substances?
That's correct. NMS Labs in Pennsylvania. It's the biggest forensic toxicology lab in the country.
Okay. We'll get back to some of the results of that in a little bit. I want to talk, well, I guess we might as well talk about them now. What were the significant results of that toxicology screen in Mr. McClain's blood?
He had been using marijuana, and there was a therapeutic level of ketamine in his blood.
Okay. Were there also screens for some of these other substances like cocaine, meth, other sorts of drugs of abuse?
Yes, we tested for all the drugs of abuse, a lot of the prescription drugs as well as some novel psychoactive substances, and that was negative.
Okay. Was that important to your opinion to rule out excited delirium or some of that kind of stuff?
It was important to rule out methamphetamine toxicity or cocaine toxicity, both of which can lead to a cardiac arrhythmia.
And you mentioned there were some marijuana metabolites in Mr. McClain's blood. In your medical opinion, did that have any medical influence on why he died?
No, I mean, he did have some active delta-9 THC in his blood, but I don't believe it contributed to death.
I'd like to talk about some of the other samples that you take during the autopsy. Did you take samples of some of the major organs?
Yes.
What does that mean? How do you do that?
You remove the organs from the body, you dissect them, and then you take small sections that are about 3 millimeters thick, put them into a little plastic case and close it up. Fix the tissue with diluted formaldehyde. Then it goes through a processor and gets put into a block of paraffin. From that, they can cut 4 micron thick sections on a cryotome and float them onto a slide. They then stain the slide, and I can look at that with a microscope to diagnose disease or injury.
That was a lot cooler of an answer than I expected that to be. So as a very shorthand way of it, it's a way for you to then microscopically be able to examine some of the organs.
Correct.
Are those preserved?
The slides and blocks, I think, are preserved indefinitely. General stock tissue, extra tissue in case we need to make more samples, I believe is retained 2 years, but possibly longer in cases of homicide. I'm not sure of the office's exact protocol on that.
Is it useful to keep those in case you need to go back and revisit something or another forensic pathologist wants to review your work?
More often the latter. Once I've looked at my slides, I'm comfortable that I've looked at them, but if another forensic pathologist does want to look at the slides, it makes it very easy for them to be able to do so.
Of the organs that you were taking samples from and examining, were any of them notable to your ultimate conclusions?
I mean, the lungs showed evidence that he had aspirated vomit at some point, so that's potentially relevant. His lungs also showed evidence of asthma, which is potentially relevant. But there was no real smoking gun. Like the ketamine would not show anything on a microscopic slide that I could identify. Clearly, there were abnormalities in his lungs. He was beginning to get some bronchitis as well, but people who are hospitalized on event get that. The biggest thing was that there was evidence of recent aspiration and evidence of asthma.
Let me talk a little bit about some of those lung findings then, since we're on the topic there. You mentioned that it did reveal evidence of aspiration, is that right?
Correct.
What was that evidence?
When you inhale gastric contents, you have cells that try to respond into your alveolar sacs in your lungs, and they try to eat up the vomit. So they're called giant cells. We had a response by these inflammatory cells trying to eat up the vomit in the lungs. So this usually takes a few days to develop, but it would be consistent with at least one vomiting episode with aspiration at the time of the incident that eventually led to his death.
When you were examining Elijah McClain's lungs, did you also find evidence of gastric contents in them?
I believe I did. Let me double check. I have giant cells when ingested foreign material, and that's commonly gastric contents.
And gastric contents, is that stomach contents like vomit?
Yes.
Was there anything abnormal about the weight of Elijah McClain's lungs when you examined them?
The right lung was 510 grams. I would say normal would probably be about 300. Left lung was 400, where it probably should have been about 200. So maybe roughly double the weight they should have been.
What can cause lungs to be so much heavier than you would expect them normally to be?
Well, in this case, it's probably a combination of inflammation in the lungs. Not only are the giant cells responding to the vomit in the lungs, you're getting some inflammation in the walls of the alveoli themselves. There was a little bit of patchy hemorrhage here and there, so all those things can add to lung weight.
Now, did you also examine Mr. McClain's brain, both
Yes,
physically and also microscopically?
correct.
Can you tell the jury what issues you found with Mr. McClain's brain?
Essentially, it's what we call a respirator brain. There was evidence of anoxic encephalopathy. His brain was deprived for a long enough period of time of no oxygen for the neurons to actually start dying. Microscopically, when neurons die, they have a bright red nucleus. We call them red neurons. So he had ischemic, dying, dead neurons throughout his brain, and his cerebellum had received so little oxygen, it was basically starting to liquefy. So this is something that we see with somebody who's brain dead on a ventilator for a few days. The brain starts to break down.
I want to break down a few of those different terms there. First, what is the cerebellum?
The cerebellum is a structure that surrounds the base of your brain, sort of in the lower back of your head.
What is the cerebellum important for?
One of the big things is balance.
When you say that there was liquefaction of the cerebellum, what is liquefaction?
That means instead of being firm, it's starting to get mushy and liquidy.
What can cause that?
In most of the cases I see, it's anoxic encephalopathy, that part of the brain's been deprived of oxygen for a long enough period of time that the neurons turn bright red and it just starts to melt.
I'm glad you mentioned anoxic cephalopathy because that was the next question I was going to ask you about. What does anoxic mean?
Lack of oxygen.
Okay, so lack of oxygen, cephalopathy, what's that?
Encephalopathy is a problem with the brain. Pathy being like um, an illness or a problem, encephalo being brain. So encephalopathy is some sort of disease or condition affecting your brain. Anoxic encephalopathy is there's a lack of oxygen that's affecting your brain and causing it to start to melt.
I was going to ask to put it in layman's terms, but lack of oxygen causing the brain to melt pretty much covers that. What are ischemic or ischemic neurons?
Um, Neurons are basically the control center cells in your brain. Your neurons synapse with each other, and that's how we think. Your neurons are attached to axons, which are basically cables that attach to other neurons to send impulses from your higher brain areas all the way down through your spinal cord and out to your body. The neuron itself includes the neuronal body, which almost looks like a little starfish in some way, and the long axon. When a neuron doesn't get enough oxygen, it starts to shrink and it becomes bright red. So that's one of the changes we look for in the microscope that you see in a brain that was deprived of oxygen.
Okay, so those ischemic neurons are a sign of that lack of oxygen to the brain?
Correct.
I'd like to talk now about your examination of Mr. McClain's heart. Can
Okay.
you please tell the jury how you went about that?
First, I sectioned the coronary arteries to look for any obstruction, look at what their size was. Following that, I made cross sections to look for any old scars or abscess or any discolorations. And following that, I would open it through the right atrium into the right ventricle, and then back out through the left atrium into the left ventricle. So that allows me to examine all the cardiac valves.
And is that examination part of what led you to be able to exclude a narrow coronary artery as a cause of death?
Um, well, the narrow coronary artery initially was a contender because it was small and I had nothing else. What allowed me to exclude that coronary artery, because I can't see all the little cross-feeding vessels that are supplying, from the other vessels, they're too small. What allowed me to exclude it is if he's a distance runner and not having heart problems doing that, this thing must have been there forever and he has collateral circulation.
One of the final things listed in your report are 8 additional cassettes submitted by Dr. Mitchell in March of 2021. Can you tell the jury what those were?
I would guess they would be heart, lung, and brain since he was an organ donor. They were the major organs that we had.
Okay. And are you aware of what happened with Mr. McClain's organs for the organ donation process?
Like who got them?
I would assume you don't know who, but generally what the process was like.
Generally, for organ donation, if a person's brain dead, they take them to the operating room, prep all the organs for removal, then cross-clamp the aorta, remove them and put them in refrigerated coolers, and then ship them off either to recipients who need them, or in some cases, they may go for research. I'm not sure in this case which way they went.
Okay. And would the body then have come to you for autopsy after the organ donation process?
That's correct. He had a suture incision from his manubrium down to his pubis, where they had opened the body up for organ procurement.
Did the fact that the organs were donated did that prevent you from rendering an effective autopsy analysis of the body?
No, I don't believe it did.
Do you know if you were consulted ahead of time to make sure that it wouldn't be an issue?
I don't think they called me. They probably called the coroner's office.
I'd like to talk a little bit now about your physical examination of Mr. McClain. Is it correct that when he came in for autopsy, he was measured at 5'7" and 140 pounds?
That's correct.
I'd like to talk about signs of physical injury and particularly abrasions on the face. Uh, Did you note 10 different facial abrasions on Mr. McClain?
Let me count real quick. Yes.
Were those scabbed?
Yes, they're starting to scab.
Was that normal? Would you expect?
If they've been around for a few days, I would expect small abrasions to start scabbing.
We don't need to go through all of them, but did you note some scabbed abrasions along Mr. McClain's jawline?
A 1/2 inch paint scab abrasion on the right jawline.
Okay, I'm going the wrong direction here. Was there another one a little bit higher up, closer to his ear?
Yes, there was.
Another a little bit higher up?
Correct.
And then did he have a series of others on his head and then also down a little bit on the other side near the ear?
Yeah, there are a couple additional ones lateral to the left eye and a few near the mid forehead. Sorry, there were 2 lateral to the left eye and 3 in the region of the mid forehead.
Did you also conduct a physical examination of Mr. McClain's hands and wrists?
Yes.
And is that classified as injuries to extremities?
That would be the heading that would be under if there were injuries.
Did you find any injuries to Elijah McClain's left wrist?
Yes, he had a 3/8 inch scabbed tram track abrasion. When I say tram track, think of railroad tracks. 2 abrasions that were in parallel to each other with a space in the middle.
In your experience as a forensic pathologist, do handcuffs leave fairly distinctive injuries like that?
Tram track abrasions or tram track contusions, which are bruises, are common if someone is struggling against handcuffs.
Are they also common if somebody's arms are being moved against the handcuffs?
Yes, pulling the arms while handcuffs are in place, if you're pulling on the handcuffs, could also cause abrasions.
If we could please show the witness, just the witness, Exhibit 170. Dr. Sina, is this a photo of those tram track style abrasions that you were talking about?
Yes.
In describing those to the jury, would it be helpful to show them exactly what you mean by that pattern of injury?
Sure.
And is this a fair and accurate copy of those abrasions from the autopsy?
Yes.
Your Honor, I'd move for admission of Exhibit 170.
170. Right, questions or objections with respect to that exhibit?
No objection.
Right, 170 may be admitted.
No, before we publish this to the jury, Dr. Sina, can you just let them know what to expect when they're looking at the image here? Is it a close-up view?
It's a close-up of the left wrist, I believe, and it shows some small parallel abrasions.
And is this from the autopsy?
Yes.
But it doesn't show any of the more gruesome parts of it.
That's correct. Usually, if we take the photographs, we have one of our case number ID things in it, but the police take photographs in tandem with us, and they don't necessarily use them. So prior to testifying today, this morning, I looked at our pictures and the police pictures, and this matches our picture.
Let's publish Exhibit 170 to the jury, please.
Must have turned off again over lunch. Let me see if I can get it back on.
Even projectors need lunch breaks.
Apparently.
Now, Mr. Campos, if we could please zoom in on the center area there. That's perfect. Dr. Sina, can you please explain to the jury what sort of injuries we see on Mr. McClain's left wrist here?
Sure. When I was talking about 2 parallel abrasions with the space in the middle, that's a tram track abrasion right there. Sort of an incomplete one there, and a little bit of a tram track abrasion there. So these would be compatible with handcuffs scraping against the skin.
We can take that down. Thank you, Dr. Sina. The next thing I'd like to talk with you about is cause of death, versus manner of death. Your cause of death in this case, was it complications of ketamine administration following forcible restraint?
Yes,
Is that something that you put in all caps in your report?
I did in this one.
What is the cause of death generally? Can you explain that? Not this specific one, but what does the concept of cause of death mean?
The cause of death is the disease or injury that starts the train of events rolling that ultimately leads to someone's death. For example, um, someone can die of sepsis, and that sepsis could have been caused by pneumonia. And they could have pneumonia because they're quadriplegic, and they could be quadriplegic because they were shot in the neck 10 years ago. So the cause of death is going to be complications of gunshot wound to the neck, even though there are all those other natural chains of events. So you have to go back to the initial chain of events to determine what your cause of death is, what started it all.
Okay. So it sounds like each of the parts of the cause of death is pretty important, even if it goes back many years to, your hypothetical about a gunshot wound.
Yes, you always want to go back to the beginning. I mean, for example, I like fairly straightforward cause of death, like complications of ketamine administration following forcible restraint. I could have gone fancier and said multi-organ system failure complicating ketamine administration following forcible restraint, but I'd rather just say complications and explain it to you guys when we get into this kind of setting.
Would it be fair to say that a cause of death is a summary of your medical findings?
Um, the cause of death is the culmination of looking at the autopsy, the toxicology, and deciding you have a single entity here that started the ball rolling that led to this person's death.
Okay. I'd like to break down the different parts of your cause of death determination in some detail, but I just want to make sure about that last part, following forcible restraint. Are you referring to the restraint by law enforcement officers of Mr. McClain?
Correct. I said following forcible restraint because that's a simple statement of fact. I'm not saying complicating forcible restraint, which would be implying that the forcible restraint played a role here. If I definitively had determined that, I would have called it a homicide instead of undetermined.
Okay, and that's the manner of death conversation we'll have in a minute there about homicide, accident, undetermined. What is the purpose of a forensic pathologist declaring or finding a cause of death?
Well, it provides closure to families. It may be important for insurance purposes. It may indicate if other family members are at risk for a certain disease, or as in this situation, it may be important in legal proceedings.
Is there another opinion that forensic pathologists offer called the manner of death?
Yes, the manner of death is a checkbox on the death certificate, which is created by vital statistics, but we try to classify our deaths with cause of death and a manner of death.
You said a few things there that I want to break down. First, that it's a matter of vital statistics. What are vital statistics?
It's a department of government that creates the death certificate. They gave us, on the death certificate, we have choices of manner of death as natural, accident, suicide, homicide, undetermined if you can't decide between a couple of those, or pending if you need more information.
Okay. So it sounds like the primary purpose of this is tracking statistics.
I believe that's a major function of it. For example, if they say the Denver homicide rate, went up 23%. Homicide is the general categorization. Within that, there are gunshot wounds as cause of death, stab wounds as cause of death, strangulation is cause of death. So cause of death is a more specific entity. And then manner of death correlates your cause of death with the circumstances surrounding the death to reach one of these checkboxes.
Okay. You mentioned some things about forensic pathology that come across wrong sometimes on TV. Is manner of death one of those things that's often portrayed wrong?
I don't know. I don't watch the shows. I used to consult for them like CSI and Lucifer, and I still didn't watch them.
Would it be fair to say that just because something is a manner of death, one thing or the other, that is not legally determinative of the outcome of a case?
There are many discrepancies between what we put in the checkbox and the legal system. For example, one of our common situations is we have people who die in motor vehicle accidents, and the other driver may be intoxicated. For us, provided that that other driver didn't intentionally ram that other vehicle and kill people, we call those accidents. But that does not preclude a prosecution for vehicular homicide. So there can be disconnects between the death certificate and the legal system.
Now, you mentioned there's sort of limited boxes you can check: accident, homicide, suicide, undetermined, and natural. I knew I was missing one. Is there a box to check for recklessly causing someone's death?
No, there's no box like that. Some states have a box for therapeutic misadventure, I believe New York and Ohio, which would be a consideration in this case, but we don't have that box.
Okay. In this case, in your amended autopsy report, what was the manner of death?
The manner of death remained undetermined. If I had felt that the ketamine alone caused death, and I was certain of that, even without any kind of restraint, I would have called this an accident. However, being that there literally is no footage available of the early sequence events, including a sleeper hold, I'm still not sure if that could have played a role in. Being that I have a doubt that, I believe the restraint may have, could have, might have contributed to his susceptibility to the ketamine. I can't say it did. If I said it did, I would call it a homicide. Being that I can't say conclusively, I went with undetermined still.
Now, just one sort of grammatical point. We appear to have a theme today of people using different terms for the technique that was done here, whether it's chokehold or sleeper hold or carotid hold. Is carotid hold the most accurate way to describe what was done here?
I think technically lateral restraint hold is the best term, but a carotid hold will work. Or a sleeper would be, if you're a WWE fan, you may be more familiar with that.
All right. Would it be fair to say if you do say a word like chokehold or sleeper hold, what you're referring to is that lateral restraint or carotid hold?
Yes, but I'm happy to be consistent with whatever you want to use today.
Okay. Okay to use carotid hold?
That'll be fine with me.
Great. Now, you mentioned that in this case, you are undetermined because you are sort of on the border between two categories of accident and homicide. Is that right?
That's correct.
I think a moment ago you said that if you were certain to a medical degree of certainty that the restraint from the officers had caused Mr. McClain's death or had contributed to it, that then you would say it's a homicide?
And that's correct, if I reach a reasonable degree of medical certainty.
So I'd like to talk now about some of the different medical conditions that Mr. McClain was suffering from and how, if at all, those affected your opinion. So first, I want to talk with you a little bit about acidosis. If restraint contributed to lactic acidosis for Mr. McClain, that would contribute to his death.
Lactic acidosis is caused by when you're intensely working your muscles to the point where your muscles' need for oxygen outweighs its supply of oxygen that it can get. So the muscles tend to get hypoxic, which is they're getting oxygen, but not all they need. When that happens, the cells start to produce lactic acid, resulting in lactic acidosis. So intense physical activity during restraint could result in lactic acidosis.
Okay. I appreciate you kind of doing a little bit of the next question for me, explaining what lactic acidosis is. That can build up in somebody in a number of different ways, right?
Correct. I most often see it in cases of somebody's septic and they tend to get lactic acidosis from that. Where I see it on people who get into the hospital after they've had cardiac arrest and their heart stopped and their body hasn't gotten good blood flow for a while. I also will see lactic acidosis in this situation.
Now, relevant to this case, if Mr. McClain was struggling to breathe or to throw up, and the restraint was keeping him from doing that, that could cause buildup of lactic acidosis.
Can you repeat that?
Sure. If Mr. McClain is, handcuffed and struggling to breathe or to throw up, but the restraint is stopping him from doing that, so he has to try physically exert himself to do it, That could lead to lactic acidosis.
If he was intensely physically exerting himself, that could lead to lactic acidosis.
And if the restraint contributed to the lactic acidosis, the proper classification of this death would be homicide.
I don't see how the restraint itself per se would cause lactic acidosis. If somebody restrained me and I don't do anything about it, I'm not going to get lactic acidosis. If I struggle against the restraint, then I will, or I potentially could.
Sure. For example, if somebody's holding you in place and you're struggling to try and breathe, that would be a way that the restraint could contribute to the exertion.
Struggling against the restraint vigorously could cause lactic acidosis.
Okay. And if the restraint caused the lactic acidosis, this would be a homicide.
If the restraint itself, once again, the restraint doesn't cause the lactic acidosis. It's the physical exertion against the restraint that causes the lactic acidosis. It's not the restraint itself.
All right, doctor, can we please show to the witness his 2021 statement, page 64? And I'll direct you to the last paragraph on that page. Specifically, the second line where it starts with but. In your prior testimony, you said, but I can't say that that didn't contribute to some degree of lactic acidosis, which theoretically could have contributed to death. You know, if it did, that would make it a homicide. I read that correctly, didn't I, doctor?
Yes, but can we go back farther to where I say, but I can't say that didn't contribute? What am I talking about with that?
Sure, sir. The question, if you look on page 62, you'll see the question starts out talking, it's in the middle of the page, lines 7 to 14. The question is about disagreements regarding whether forcible restraint should be classified as a homicide or not. Do you see what I'm talking about on lines 7 to 14 there?
I think we're talking about manner of death in that question.
Yes.
Okay.
And whether it would be homicide or not.
And I think we're saying basically, can reasonable forensic pathologists disagree on this topic? Yes, I think given the same set of facts in this case, reasonable forensic pathologists can disagree on manner of death.
Sure. And some of that might be based upon their experience in the field or on the information that they analyzed.
It could be people can make their own opinions.
Now, acidosis as a medical condition, you can take that down. Thanks, Mr. Campos. Somebody who has acidosis or lactic acidosis, how do they normally clear that condition? How do they normally get better?
Stretching helps. I mean, if anyone's ever worked out and had sore muscles, you've had lactic acidosis. So stretching can help. Deep breathing in the short term and basically relaxing and resting the muscles, good hydration, things of that nature.
Okay, so I heard you say stretching, heavy breathing, and hydration.
I think those are the major ways to bring your lactic acid down after a heavy workout.
Okay. If somebody's in handcuffs with one police officer behind him and another on his legs, it's pretty hard for that person to stretch.
Yeah, I don't think they'd be doing a stretching routine in that situation.
Okay. And heavy breathing, for example, if you are being held in a position where you can't expand the walls of your chest effectively, it's hard to get that heavy breathing, isn't it?
Yeah, if you were put in that kind of position, it could be hard to breathe.
If you can't breathe well or you can't stretch, it's actually pretty difficult, if not impossible, to clear lactic acidosis, isn't it?
I would ask somebody who treats people with lactic acidosis. I haven't seen a live patient in 20 years.
Okay, so somebody like a pulmonologist who does this day in and day out?
Or a nephrologist, some doctor who sees people with lactic acidosis.
Now, in addition to the position that you're in, if there's any obstructions to your mouth or your airway, that can also prevent you from doing this heavy breathing necessary to clear acidosis.
And that could, obstructions of the airway can make breathing difficult.
Okay. If somebody is being held down in a prone position, that makes it difficult for them to expand their diaphragm and do that heavy breathing, right?
Little controversy on that topic. Some studies came out, I think about 25, 30 years ago, saying restraint in a prone position. Particularly, they were looking at people who are put in the back of police cars, laying down with that hump sitting in their belly. That can affect your respirations. Then other studies came out saying just simply being restrained with your hands behind your back on your stomach, unless you're obese, really didn't do much to your respirations. But after looking at all of it, I would say a heavy person is more at risk than a thin person if they're on their belly for a prolonged period of time. And if you have some weight on your back for a prolonged period of time, it wouldn't surprise me if you got hypoxic to some degree.
So weight on a person's back can be a big influence on that.
Particularly if they're obese.
Uh,
The patient, I mean, well, I guess either person, if you have an obese officer on their back, that could be bad, or if you had an obese person restrained on their belly.
Now, another reason you might not be able to clear lactic acidosis is if your lung function was impaired in some way. Is that fair?
That could affect proper oxygenation to clear the lactic acid if you have bad lungs.
Okay. For example, if there was aspiration in somebody's lungs, it would be difficult for them to do the kinds of heavy breathing necessary to clear acidosis.
Aspirating a significant amount of vomit could make it difficult to clear lactic acidosis. Chronic conditions such as asthma could also make it difficult to correct lactic acidosis.
Okay. Well, let's talk about the role of aspiration specifically in your opinion here. You hold open the possibility that that aspiration during Elijah McClain's restraint was possible in this case.
It is possible that while he was restrained on his side that he did aspirate to some degree. I can't prove that, nor can I refute it.
Okay. And you also think that if somebody is held in the lateral position with their shoulder on the ground and their other shoulder up in the air, that it's less likely to have aspiration. Fair?
Correct. That's a safer position than lying on your back and just throwing up into your mouth.
Sure. It's much safer than being on your back.
Correct.
Okay. It's also safer than being in a prone position.
Correct.
And you'd agree that if somebody's mouth is obstructed, aspiration is a higher risk than if their mouth is not obstructed.
I would say if you had a tight covering over your mouth and you threw up, you would be at higher risk to aspirate than if you didn't.
Okay. A tight covering, like a mask that covered the whole mouth and nose area?
That could put you at increased risk for aspiration.
And you know that Mr. McClain was wearing just such a mask in this incident, but you're not able to see exactly when that mask comes off. Is that fair?
That's fair.
Is that part of the reason why you don't think that you can quite get to the point where saying aspiration definitely happened here?
Well, I mean, I believe I stated previously that we know he vomited while he was restrained. We know he vomited while he was in the ambulance. When he was restrained, he was on his side. When he was in the ambulance, he was unconscious on his back. I said previously, not here in another proceeding, that I can't tell when the aspiration happened, only that it did happen. But if I had to pick, I would say 51% chance in the ambulance and slightly less than 50% during restraint.
And to be clear, this is not necessarily an either or choice, is it right? It could be both and.
That's true. There could have been 2 episodes of aspiration, but after he vomited, he was talking and apologizing for it. Most people who aspirate try to clear the stuff out of their trachea and cough violently, like if anything's gone down the wrong pipe with you. I didn't hear that. So could he have aspirated a little during restraint? Yes. But he didn't do the usual violent coughing to clear it as if he aspirated a lot.
It sounds like coughing is the main reason that you would lean towards the aspiration being later on rather than early in the counter.
I would say Lack of severe coughing and talking normally after the first vomiting episode, and the fact that lying on your back unconscious puts you at higher risk to aspirate than being on your side. Granted, I don't know if the mask was on or off at that point. That would be another risk factor for actually aspirating on your side. So it could have been, if I had to pick one, it'd be the ambulance, but I can't say it wasn't a little both.
Now, you mentioned that you would expect coughing if there was aspiration. And I know you don't treat live patients, but are you aware that there are things that could cause you not to start coughing like crazy if you'd aspirated?
Um, Probably if you had some sort of nervous dysfunction or some sort of lack of a gag reflex or some other reflex, but I would defer to a pulmonologist.
Well, it can be as simple as the fact that the aspiration gets past those nerves and is just way down in your lungs, right?
Um, when you have vomit going down your trachea, that's irritating as well. So that'll often cause coughing as well.
Sure, but if it goes past that point and settles in the lungs, those nerves are not going to be stimulated anymore.
Um, that would be correct, but in my cases of aspiration that I see, pretty much everyone who has it in their lungs has it in their trachea at autopsy.
Although to be fair, most of the aspiration cases you see are not like this one.
Correct. They People vomit and aspirate all the time while they're dying. I mean, dying's unpleasant. I've seen aspiration from heart attacks. Most commonly, I see it related to drug overdoses where people are going out, passing out, unconscious, vomiting and inhaling it and dying.
Just to sort of wrap up a little bit of this positioning and aspiration conversation, Doctor, one of the reasons that you don't call this death and accident is because of the possibility that the prone restraint of Mr. McClain played a role in his death.
I didn't really see all that much prone restraint. I saw more restraint on his side. There was a little bit of prone restraint at the beginning, but I don't believe that played a role. What I was more concerned about was, um, what are we calling it? The carotid hold. The carotid hold, even though it's safe and used in martial arts competitions for decades, and doesn't have any reported deaths, it can induce nausea in some people after they come to from the carotid hold. The carotid hold itself doesn't affect your airway at all. You can still breathe. People snore during it, so your body's not being deprived of oxygen. But when people come to from having their brain deprived from oxygen, some may vomit. And if he vomited during restraint and it was related to the carotid hold, and if he aspirated from that episode, then that would be contributory and I would make it a homicide, but I can't concretely connect those three dots.
And just to close up the loop on the question about prone restraint, could we please show the witness page 65 of his 2021 statement? And Doctor, I'll direct your attention to lines 4 through 6, starting in that paragraph. In 2021, you said, "I don't want to call it an accident because I can't rule out that the prone restraint or the carotid stimulus played a role." I read that correctly, didn't I?
You did. The carotid stimulus we haven't talked about yet, but I can. Prone restraint, I probably should have actually talked about the aspiration of vomit. I'm not sure why I said prone restraint because that's very little in the video.
Okay. But the periods where Mr. McClain is prone restrained are like the last 3 minutes, the most dangerous time.
You'd have to replay the video for me.
We'll get there in a little bit. Let's talk about your opinion regarding the role of ketamine in both the cause and manner of death.
Sure.
Was Mr. McClain's blood level of ketamine within what's typically considered the therapeutic range?
Yes.
What sort of resources did you consult to determine what the proper range was to consider the therapeutic range?
Well, NMS Labs comes with a little blurb on each drug that's detected, so that's one source. The bigger source would be a guy named Randy Baselt, Baselt, wrote a forensic toxicology textbook, which I use quite often, and that had a lot of information as well.
Now, In explaining to the jury sort of what the therapeutic range is and where Mr. McClain fell, would it be helpful to show them a chart that depicts those numbers?
If you'd like.
Could we show the witness what has been marked as demonstrative 301? I'm going to take your honor's advice and try and do this electronically instead of with butcher block paper. So is this an accurate, well, is this just a graph going from 0 to 7?
Graph going from 0 to 7.
And then could we go forward one? Does this show what the Basalt textbook says is the therapeutic range for ketamine blood concentration of 1 to 6.3 milligrams a liter?
Yes, it does.
And then let's add the next one. Does this show the accurate measure of Mr. McClain's ketamine level in his blood?
Yes, it does.
Now, in your opinion, you describe this case as complications of ketamine administration following forcible restraint. How is, just leave it up there. How is complications of ketamine administration different, if it is, than a ketamine overdose?
Because a ketamine overdose would be somewhere up here where it's way above the therapeutic range. What I'm saying is complications of ketamine administration is, for whatever reason, it could be this guy's individual chemistry. Maybe there's a touch of asthma. Maybe there's some aspiration. This level of ketamine shouldn't have killed the average person, but based on the video of him getting it and being almost dead a minute and a half, 2 minutes later, it did. So for him, it was just too much. That's why I said complications of ketamine administration instead of just calling it a ketamine overdose, because it's not in the lethal range.
You mentioned an overdose case might be much higher than this. Is the fatal overdose case that you're familiar with at 27 milligrams per liter?
What case are you talking about?
Let's show just the witness, please. It's 2021 statement. And I'm referring you, doctor, to page 58, lines 10 through 14.
Oh, I thought you were talking about one of my cases that had a level of 27. I've had ketamine overdoses. I don't remember the numbers on them, but yes, the Basalt textbook had a case that it was at 27.
Okay, and let's go back to our chart for the jury, please. So to be fair to say that the overdose case in the Basalt textbook would require, I mean, almost 20 times more ketamine than what Mr. McClain had?
Just about, yes.
You mentioned you've seen ketamine overdose cases. Have you ever seen one where the therapeutic range of ketamine was in somebody's blood?
No, which is why I didn't call it a ketamine overdose. That would imply it's in the lethal range. I'm implying that this level of ketamine was too much for him at that time.
And that's what that word complications means. It's some sort of interaction between the drug and the person's condition or innate sensitivity.
Right. I mean, I can't tell you if he got this dose of ketamine in a hospital setting, if the same situation would have happened, if he would have died. He may have. That'd be called an idiosyncratic drug reaction. He just can't handle this drug. On the other hand, is it possible that aspiration and maybe an asthma attack predisposed him to dying at this level? Yes, that's possible. Once again, that's why I'm at undetermined instead of accident versus homicide.
Well, you mentioned a couple of things that were possibilities about Mr. McClain's natural behavior, but the other complication could be the circumstance that he was put in, right?
Now, can you be more specific?
Sure. I mean, the fact that he's restrained or prone or weakened from the struggle with law enforcement or the restraint of him, those circumstances could be involved in complications of ketamine administration.
The circumstances leading up to him getting the ketamine may have played a role in him being so susceptible to it, which is why I can't rule out homicide, nor can I prove it, hence undetermined.
Okay. So please tell me if I'm misunderstanding what you're saying, but it sounds like complications of ketamine administration could be broadly grouped into two categories. One would be some sort of unusual sensitivity in the patient, in Mr. McClain, whether it was asthma or something in his biochemistry, as you mentioned, or the other would be complications from something that happened in this incident, something with his medical condition when he was given the ketamine. Is that fair?
I think it's fair to say that it could be either one of those or both. He may just not be able to handle ketamine. Maybe he was able to handle this dose of ketamine had he not theoretically aspirated at that time, or not theoretically been having an asthma attack, or not theoretically been in lactic acidosis. Since I don't know if any of those happened, but they could have, maybe they made him more susceptible to ketamine. I just don't know.
Okay, so let's talk about the first bucket then, the sensitivity, that there's something about Mr. McClain that would make him hypersensitive to the drug. You reviewed his medical records, right?
Correct.
He didn't have any known allergies to ketamine or anything in that drug family, did he?
Not that I'm aware of, no.
Are you aware of any other cases you've seen where somebody was hypersensitive to ketamine?
I've not had an idiosyncratic drug death from ketamine. I've had it from other drugs.
Okay. So it would be literally unheard of for you to have a patient who's hypersensitive to ketamine and have this dose kill them.
Literally unheard of for me to see somebody die with this level.
Yeah.
Yeah, I've not had a person die of a ketamine administration complication at this level before.
Okay, so let's turn to the second bucket then. Stuff that was going on with Mr. McClain's health and the situation he's in when he's given the ketamine. So why don't we start talking about, known predictable effects of ketamine? One of the big ones is that it sedates you, right?
That's the idea, yes.
And the other big one is that it can depress your respiration.
Correct.
So the more sedated somebody is, the less their body is going to be able to do things like move, cough, or even breathe on their own, right?
Correct.
The less capable somebody's going to be able to be to clear their own airway.
Correct. The more sedated you are, even to the point of unconsciousness, if you vomit and aspirate, it'd be hard to clear your airway.
If somebody is sedated enough, in deep sedation, they're not even able to adjust their position, are they?
Yeah, it depends on the level of sedation. You're getting into specifics where an anesthesiologist might be better.
Sure. Would it be fair as a generality to say that the deeper the sedation, the greater risk of aspiration?
I would say that's fair.
So when you say, in your opinion, complications of ketamine administration following forcible restraint, that could include complications like Elijah McClain couldn't clear his airway, adjust his position, or is it a greater risk of aspiration due to sedation, like we just discussed?
Yeah, the complications, as you just described, would be he'd be at high risk for aspirating vomit when he's sedated and unconscious on his back in an ambulance.
Let's talk about the second, known predictable effect of ketamine, that it depresses respiration. Is that a problem that can be worse if somebody is being held prone?
If you're being held prone with heavy weight on your back, that could exacerbate ketamine respiratory suppression.
And I think, as you said earlier, the more weight that's placed on you, the more dangerous that is.
Yes.
Similarly, if you have depressed respiration and you can't move to be able to expand your chest, that can make that problem worse.
I think you're saying the same thing. Aren't you with like the prone restraint? Like, what do you mean can't move?
That's fair. That inability to move to expand your chest could be a consequence of prone restraint.
Right. If there was very heavy prone restraint, it could affect your lungs from going in and out.
You keep saying very heavy, but like Elijah McClain's 140 pounds, right?
That's correct. He was in life, he was probably a little heavier prior to the organ donation.
And when you viewed the video, in the minutes before he gets ketamine, he's pretty out of it.
Well, he reacted up to the point where they lifted up his sleeve to get the injection. When he got the shot itself, he didn't really react to that.
Okay. But I mean, it doesn't take a lot of weight to hold somebody down or to restrict their movement when they're that weakened, does it?
Well, I mean, how weakened is he and what's he weakened from?
But sure, that's the kind of question you'd want to ask somebody who sees live patients and does this for a living, right?
Um, I mean, from the video, to me, he looks like he's worn out and not struggling as much toward the end.
Okay. Weakened?
I would say tired out, exhausted. As far as hypoxic or lactic acidotic, there's no real way to really know how much he was of either one of those. So unless you take blood from him while he's down there, so I can't tell you how much that played a role.
It sounds like you're unwilling to say unless you had a number. Like this is how much acid, this is where his pH level is at. That's what it would take for you to be able to say he's acidotic?
No, I would say that given that he was intensely struggling for a period of time, he had some degree of hypoxia and some degree of lactic acidosis. Whether it was life-threatening, I don't think you can say without measuring it.
Would you agree that depressed respiration, known side effect of ketamine, would prevent you from clearing that acidosis?
Respiratory depression from ketamine administration could help you from resolving lactic acidosis. Or sorry, could impair you from resolving your lactic acidosis.
That depressed respiration could also aggravate hypoxia that somebody was feeling, that shortage of oxygen to the brain.
Um, well, I mean, hypoxia generally, I mean, with the case of the carotid hole, the hypoxia would be limited to the brain, which is about 1/50th of his body size. As far as whole body hypoxia, if you had very impaired respirations and you were sedated, you could get hypoxic from ketamine and not being able to breathe.
But specifically focusing on depressed respiration, known side effect of ketamine, that could make hypoxic problems that are already existing worse.
Yes, if you were sedated from ketamine and you had respiratory depression, that could make you more hypoxic.
Now, I'd like to talk a little bit about how you evaluated the information in this case, Dr. Sina. We discussed earlier that before your original autopsy report, despite your best efforts to get more footage, you only had about 10 minutes of camera footage.
Now, that's what I said.
But for your amended report, you were able to spend about 30 minutes watching it.
Like I said, that was probably a ballpark number. It felt like much longer.
Okay, so maybe it was a couple hours.
That's what it felt like, at least from my recollection.
It sounds like you probably just watched straight through whatever it was that they sent you.
I believe I did one afternoon.
Do you remember where you spent that afternoon? Yeah, on the couch in the office?
I have a home office.
You also requested to have a pulmonologist evaluate Mr. McClain's case, right?
Yeah, I believe I wanted a pulmonologist to see if I was on the right track when I said he got the ketamine and a minute and a half, 2 minutes later, he's in agonal breathing. So I wanted a pulmonologist to confirm my assessment of his breathing at that point.
You only want a pulmonologist if he can confirm your assessment, or you want to actually listen to the pulmonologist?
No, if he disagreed with me, I'd listen to him, but he agreed with me
About what?
that I was seeing agonal breathing.
Okay. Do you remember any other findings that the pulmonologist had?
No, and I keep messing up his name. I think it's like Bucher, but I don't believe I've ever met him.
Okay. In addition to wanting a consult from a pulmonologist to see if he agreed with your diagnosis of agonal breathing, you also wanted a pulmonologist because you just haven't seen living patients in over 15 years, right?
I don't recall if I had said that at the previous legal proceeding, then I would go with that. I mean, that previous legal proceeding was 1,000 autopsies ago, so I don't really remember that either.
It's not a memory test. I'm asking you, as a forensic pathologist, first of all, this is correct, right? You haven't treated living patients in 15, 20 years?
No, probably not since 2006.
Okay. So, not a test about your prior statements. It's useful to have somebody who treats live patients because of their particular expertise, right?
For me, in this case, it would be useful to have him say, yes, this is agonal breathing. I believe that was the focus of why I did the consult, but I don't recall anything else.
You keep coming back to this thing. The only thing you want to hear from the pulmonologist is that he can confirm agonal breathing. That's the only thing you would ever want to hear from him, Frower?
That was really why I wanted him to see it, to see if he agreed with me that this guy was breathing funny.
Have
So,
you-
I mean, I'm sure he could teach me other things about pulmonology, but I don't know if I was asking for a lecture.
Okay. You also would say that he would be in a better position, a pulmonologist would be in a better position to evaluate a patient or Mr. McClain's breathing generally, not just agonal breathing, right?
Correct.
He would also be in a better position to evaluate whether Mr. McClain was in medical distress before he got the ketamine, right?
I would probably go to an ER doc to assess the level of distress, but I would think a pulmonologist would be better than me if you're trying to assess a living person's breathing problems.
Okay. And potentially some forms of medical distress, especially if they were breathing related.
Correct. If he had some sort of subtype of a breathing variation, um, like tachypnea, or Kussmaul breathing, Kussmaul respirations, asthma, I would think a pulmonologist might have a better eye for that than I do.
A pulmonologist who regularly treats live patients might also have a better eye for how sedated Mr. McClain was, since they sedate people all the time.
I think the video is fairly straightforward of when he's getting onto the gurney, that this guy is very sedated and having agonal breathing. So I don't think you need a pulmonologist for that, but being that this was going to be a high profile case, I wanted someone to assess my opinion on that.
But Dr. Sina, the last 30 seconds he's on the gurney dying isn't the only important part of this case. There's 20 minutes of stuff that happens to him before that.
And argumentative.
Sustain.
So Dr. Sina, even though it might be obvious he's heavily sedated on the gurney, a pulmonologist who day in and day out treats live patients and sedates them might be in a better position to evaluate his level of sedation prior to that.
Do you mean his level of sedation prior to getting ketamine?
Prior to getting ketamine and immediately after, before he gets on the gurney and it's obvious what's happening.
Well, I wouldn't say he was sedated at all prior to the ketamine because he wasn't given any kind of sedative. I guess a pulmonologist could try to evaluate his breathing prior to the ketamine and make some opinions on that.
Okay. But specifically, you think a pulmonologist would be better placed than you to evaluate whether Mr. McClain had been heavily sedated or not, right?
After the ketamine,
At all phases.
I feel very comfortable, pulmonologist or not, that he was very sedated after the ketamine. Being that he wasn't given a sedative, he wasn't sedated before the ketamine. However, this does not mean that he couldn't have been in some degree of distress. I certainly think a pulmonologist might be able to comment on that as well.
Okay. Can we show the witness's prior statement from 2021 and page 55? And Dr. Sina, I'll direct your attention to that first full paragraph where you answered, yeah, there are. In certain circumstances, there are. You're being asked about consults.
Okay.
Like I said, most causes of death are fairly straightforward. But in this case, I actually had footage of somebody who was in the process of dying. I haven't treated living patients in probably 15 years. A pulmonologist might be in a better position to assess that person's breathing and say, no, he wasn't really in distress, or he's heavily sedated, or, he's dying.
Okay.
That's why I thought a pulmonologist might be in a better position than me to assess what was going on in his lungs right then. And in that quote, you're referring to Mr. McClain's lungs, right?
Right. And I believe that's after the ketamine.
So, Dr. Steiner, is your sworn testimony to this jury that when you made that whole statement about how useful a pulmonologist would be, that you think he's only useful for after the ketamine when he's on the gurney already dying? That the pulmonologist is useless to your opinion for everything before that?
No, I'm not saying he's useless. I'm saying my specific question was about the agonal breathing, and he agreed with me on that. He may be able to hear or see something in the rest of the footage that I don't see. So he can certainly comment on things happening before the ketamine. My focus was more with what was happening after the ketamine. Is he really about to die from what I'm seeing on the gurney? But certainly he can comment if he heard subtle breathing cues prior to the ketamine. He'd probably be better than me at that.
Okay, I appreciate that. And suffice to say, whatever the pulmonologist's conclusions were, besides the one you mentioned about agonal breathing, you don't remember what any of them were.
That's correct. I haven't seen his report in forever, if I've seen it at all.
Well, let's throw up Dr. Buther's report. Page 5. And third paragraph. Line. The one thing you say that Dr. Buther agreed upon you.
Jason, objection. This is improper impeachment because the witness has not been confronted with whether he's ever reviewed this. I think he said that he's not sure he's actually ever seen the report.
He already testified he's reviewed Dr. Buther's report.
I thought I heard him
Well,
say.
it's rather unclear.
Did you review Dr. Buther's report, Dr. Sina?
If I did, it would have been a while ago. I don't specifically remember.
Okay. Could you take a look at this paragraph? Especially the third line. Fair to say the one thing you think that Dr. Buther agrees with you on, he doesn't actually agree with you on? I mean, he says these respirations are not yet agonal, right?
Right there, he says not yet agonal. But then he says later on that he was transitioned from being conscious and able to protect his airway and breathe to 2 minutes after the ketamine that he could not.
Yeah,
So he could not breathe on his own. Further,
that's, sorry, Dr. Sina, that's one of those opinions where Dr. Buther says that he's no longer able to protect his airway. That's one of the opinions that you didn't even remember before today, that you didn't really consider in your report, right?
oh no, I mean, I agree that he wasn't able to protect his airway after the ketamine, which is why he's at risk for aspirating when he's unconscious in the ambulance. I think I've said that a few times.
Just 1 second, doctor. I appreciate your time, Dr. Sina. That's all I've got for you.
Okay.
Would you rather take a break now or get started for 15 or 20 minutes?
Or do you and the jury, Your Honor? I would have to take a break.
All right, we'll go ahead and take our afternoon People of the state of Colorado v. Nathan Woodyard. Dr. Sina is on the witness stand, still under oath. You may begin your cross-examination.
Dr. Sina, good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
You were kind enough to speak with Mr. Ho and I about this case in September. Do you remember that?
I remember speaking. I don't remember the whole conversation.
Oh, that's okay. You just remember being on a Zoom type call with us?
Correct.
Okay. So that we could understand your report and ask you some questions.
Correct.
And do you remember me saying to you, just to kind of start off, it seems like in this case, there's a lot of speculation.
Sustained.
In this case, it seems like, well, there's a lot of speculation.
Well, I don't feel I'm speculating. I'm saying what I can prove.
Well, in terms of what cannot be proven, the if could questions, that would be speculative in your expert opinion.
Sustained.
Let me ask it a different way. When you are looking at conducting an autopsy or conducting a death investigation, you're evaluating evidence, correct?
Correct.
And you get some context about a case from the police or the investigators. You get some kind of narrative so you understand what it is you're being asked to do, what kind of case you're looking at.
Right. The narrative gives me the initial nuts and bolts of the case. I have an idea of what's going on with the case.
And sometimes there are theories that you can develop from the evidence and the narrative, right?
Sometimes the narrative will lead me toward certain specific techniques of dissection. For example, if somebody's found face down in a window well, I'm going to dissect the posterior neck to look for a broken neck, which I don't normally do. So the narrative can lead me to do special things.
And as you get into your investigation, there sometimes are possibilities that you can identify, correct?
Possibilities regarding,
Possibilities regarding cause of death.
correct. As I've discussed in this case, there's several possibilities that could have contributed to death.
And then once you identify possibilities, you work to compare them with what the evidence tells you, right?
Right. When you have possibilities, you do your best to try to either prove them or disprove them.
I was just going to ask you, you try to exclude possibilities with what the evidence can tell you, correct?
Correct.
And you try to prove the possibilities, what the evidence can tell you, right?
To the best of your ability, yes.
And sometimes you can't do either, right?
Unfortunately, that's correct too.
Sometimes there are just some unknowns in a case.
That's correct.
And it's important in your role as a forensic pathologist that you don't assume something that can't be known from the evidence in terms of what you are trying to do.
In my reports and in my testimony, I try to stick with what I feel comfortable saying to a reasonable degree of medical certainty.
Dr. Sina, you've already explained that you conducted the autopsy in this case, and you are contracted with the state or the county? I can't remember.
Contracted with Adams County.
Okay. And so you also, as an expert, are compensated for your time and work on a case, right?
I believe the state is compensating me for my time today,
And
hopefully.
and the state has paid you in the ballpark of $8,625. Does that sound about right?
For this trial,
Well, that's the last figure I have, so it could be more than that, right?
I believe the flat fee for this trial is $5,000. I'm not sure what fees are leading up to it. There was a previous trial that I was also paid $5,000 for
Okay. Flat fee of $5,000 for
a day of testimony.
perfect. And you have testified as a forensic pathologist. I'm not going to expect an exact number, but approximately how many cases?
Between 350 and 400.
Forensic pathology is a specific kind of medical certification. Is that right?
It's a subspecialty of within pathology.
And you were saying earlier that your role as a forensic pathologist is to explain medical evidence to a jury, right?
That's part of our training, is to try to relay medical terminology into terms a jury can appreciate in their deliberations.
And also part of your role is to conduct the investigation of the evidence in a court case, of the physical evidence of a body,
Can you rephrase that?
to do an autopsy.
Yes,
Okay.
my main role here, the reason I'm here is because I did the autopsy.
And in the cases that you have testified in, that you just described, were all of those for the prosecution?
I would say for Adams County, at least, probably 98% are for the prosecution, maybe 99%. For consult cases for wrongful deaths, medical malpractice, a few criminal cases from around the country. Sometimes it'll be for the plaintiff, sometimes it'll be for the defense. I think it splits about 50-50, but in general, if I performed an autopsy, it's the prosecution that's calling me, not usually the defense.
You do not, I just want to confirm this with you. You do not recall whether or not you were ever provided with Dr. Buther's written reports?
Right. I don't recall if I read it. It was probably 2 years ago.
Okay. You did get to connect in this case with Dr. Mitchell. Is that correct?
Yes, he came to the office and I showed him where the stock tissue was so he could make more slides.
And I just want to go back. I meant to clarify with you as well that you were asked questions about suggesting that a pulmonologist be involved in the review of this case, right?
Correct. I was asked questions about that.
And I just wanted to confirm what you were saying earlier, if I understood. You wanted a pulmonologist to look at a very specific portion of that video camera evidence. Is that right?
My recollection is I wanted him to comment on the type of breathing seen after the ketamine.
Well, that's what I'm asking. You wanted him to look at whether this was agonal breathing. Is that correct?
Correct.
Okay. Have you had an opportunity to see Dr. Mitchell's report?
At one point.
Okay. And you told us that you know him, you know who he is, right?
Right. There's only 475 of us in the country. So when we go to meetings, we run into each other. I won't consider him a close friend, but we're on friendly terms.
And you had said earlier that you respect him as a professional.
I do.
And you disagree with him. Is that right?
In this case, yes.
In this case, okay. Pathologists can have different backgrounds or philosophies, I think you've said, right?
Yes, you can have, depending on where you train, your chief may have a certain philosophy that he imparts onto his trainees. Your experiences may influence how you arrive at an opinion on cases. So two competent forensic pathologists can be presented with same set of facts and differ in their final conclusions.
And are some, in your experience, are some pathologists also advocates?
Advocates for
Causes they care about.
Sustained.
Can you tell us why you agree or disagree with Dr. Mitchell's opinion?
I believe he called this a homicide and I called it undetermined. I believe, whereas I can say that the actions of the police may have, could have, or might have contributed to death, I can't say did. And I believe he can say did, and I'm at those other three things. So for me, that's undetermined. For him, it's a homicide.
And you, of course, you're not aware of any different evidence that he was presented with. It's just a reasonable minds can differ. I'm asking him if he knows whether there's anything else related.
Sustained.
Do you have any reason to believe yourself that there's any other information available which you have not reviewed? I'm asking if he has any reason to believe that there's something he was not provided.
Well, that really would cause him to speculate. There always could be something. So rephrase.
Did you review all of the evidence that you were provided in this case?
Yes.
The reason, just very basically, Dr. Sina, for an autopsy is that the physical body, as you were explaining, can sometimes explain a cause of death in terms of you can see an injury or something that led to the death event. Is that a fair way to ask that?
In most autopsies, um, at least half, you can come away from the autopsy table and say, I know the cause of death. Um, in others, such as this, and of course, all my overdoses, I have to wait for toxicology to come back. Now, I can get hints from the autopsy that it's going to be an overdose, heavy lungs, fluid in the lungs. So maybe half the cases, you know the cause of death right after you're done. The other half, you will have to wait for additional studies or information.
And in this particular case, Dr. Sina, there were no physical injuries that you found during the autopsy, physical injuries that caused death.
And that's correct. There were some minor scrapes, but there was no injury to the larynx or the hyoid bone to indicate strangulation or asphyxiation. There were no broken bones. There was no bleeding inside your head like a subdural hematoma. So there was no injury to explain death when I finished the autopsy.
And in this case, going back to the question about reviewing all of the information, because of the nature of this case, it made sense for you to review the body camera footage. Would you agree with that?
Yes, it's recommended to do that in these type of cases.
And you, at the beginning, had some of the body camera footage, as I understood, but not all of it.
Correct.
Okay. You had said that you had reviewed about 10 minutes of the body camera footage in terms of what was provided to you initially. Is that right?
That's right. I'm not sure exactly because I don't remember the meeting, but I think the meeting was 30 or 40 minutes. If I said 10 minutes then, my recollection would have been better then than it is now.
Okay. And I wanted to confirm with you that you don't recall whether that was sort of the beginning 10 minutes of the incident or what portion you reviewed initially?
It definitely wasn't the time around the administration of the ketamine. It may have included the initial contact and portions of where the body camera was dislodged. So there's no actual video available of the carotid hole. So it basically was a lack of video for that. So, but aside from that, I don't really remember the details. It certainly wasn't the whole incident over the 10, 12 minutes or whatever from multiple cameras, which I got later.
And it sounds like that the portion that you were provided with included the struggle. Is that correct?
I think a limited portion of it.
Okay. And then you eventually were provided with all of the body camera evidence, right?
That's my understanding, yes.
And there were a number of questions asked to you about the fact that the body camera evidence wasn't provided to you in its entirety from the beginning. Did anybody ever tell you you couldn't have it?
What I had stated earlier, which probably came from that meeting, was that I was told that I could have additional footage after I signed the initial report.
At which point, having it all, if you needed to do an amended report, as you've discussed, you absolutely would be able to do, right?
Correct. As in this case, if I receive additional information and it's enough to change the cause of death, then I can issue an amended report.
So once you reviewed the entirety of the body camera footage, what changed for you in terms of getting some more compelling information was the injection of ketamine, that temporal relationship. Did I understand that correctly?
Correct. He gets the shot within a minute and a half or 2 minutes. He's gasping like a fish, virtually unconscious. And within 2 minutes of that, he's in his first cardiac arrest.
You have said that you really only needed to see those 10 seconds of the video.
I did say that it's a simplification. To determine the cause of death in this case, I basically needed those 10 seconds. However, to be thorough, I did need to see everything to be able to exclude other possibilities.
Absolutely. To be clear, based upon your entire review, both the autopsy, toxicology, the body cam, everything you've reviewed, there is no evidence that Mr. McClain would have died if he did not get the ketamine injection?
I believe I stated in my opinion that, but for the ketamine administration at that time, I believe he would be alive. I don't have an injury or any concrete body chemistry studies prior to that to say that he would have died of ketamine or not. So being that the vast majority of people do survive physical restraint, I see no reason to think that he wouldn't have recovered if given enough time if he didn't get the ketamine.
You use the words "but for," meaning that along this series of events, without the ketamine coming along, essentially, we don't have death.
That's my opinion. And when the pulmonologist, when I had the little highlighted section from the pulmonologist report just now, the first line said he deteriorated rapidly when he got the ketamine. So I think he sees a temporal relationship as well.
You were asked a number of questions on direct examination, which started with the word "if," and I want to revisit those. If Mr. McClain was experiencing hypoxia, I'm going to stop and ask you a different question. Is there any evidence? Can you say beyond to a reasonable degree of medical certainty that Mr. McClain did experience hypoxia prior to the ketamine?
I would say after struggling for several minutes, fairly vigorously, and certainly to start, there would be some degree of hypoxia, but I don't see why it would be in a lethal range.
Well, and I appreciate that clarification. In terms of severe hypoxia, is that a better way to characterize that? Is there any evidence that he was in severe hypoxia?
No one put a pulse oximeter on him to see what his oxygen saturation was. So um, I, I can't exclude the possibility that he was in significant hypoxia or that he had minimal hypoxia. I'm not sure if he had a hypoxia or how much hypoxia he might have had.
So while it can't be excluded and it is possible, we don't know.
Like I said, I think with the struggle, he would have some hypoxia, but I see no evidence to say that it'd be lethal hypoxia.
With respect to acidosis, similarly, you have no way to opine whether or to what degree Mr. McClain was experiencing acidosis prior to the ketamine.
Other than if you're vigorously exerting yourself, you're probably going to get some degree of lactic acidosis that should correct itself. So it wouldn't surprise me if over the course of his exertions that he had some hypoxia, which leads to some lactic acidosis, but without taking a blood draw and measuring it, I have no idea how much lactic acidosis he had during the struggle. I know he was in lactic acidosis at the hospital when he arrived, but he'd also undergone cardiac arrest, so his body didn't get oxygen, and it's really common to see lactic acidosis after that.
And prior to the ketamine administration, there are factors that would have made Mr. McClain less at risk of severe acidosis, right?
Well, being physically in shape, helps you resist lactic acidosis and hypoxia. And what I understand, he was a runner. He was also lean and not obese, and his other organs seemed to be in good shape.
With respect to aspiration, Dr. Sina, we understand that you found this microscopic evidence in his lungs, right? That there was aspiration, as you said, at some point.
Correct. He did aspirate vomit at some point.
But you cannot tell us when. No one can tell us when, in your opinion.
I can't tell if it was during the restraint, in the ambulance, or a little bit of both or more. Once again, if I had to pick, I'd say he's more at risk in the ambulance, but he could have aspirated some when he was under restraint. I'm not sure.
While we don't know in terms of where there was that highest risk, he's at higher risk in the ambulance because he is supine, unconscious, correct?
In my opinion, he'd be, when he's unconscious, heavily sedated, barely breathing, and supine and throwing up, he's at a somewhat higher risk of aspirating that situation than lying on his side on the ground, even with a mask on.
Because in addition, when you are in that position, you can't protect your airway, right?
That's correct. Everything that's going out is coming back down.
And there's actually evidence that you've seen of that continued emesis or what we might consider vomiting continuing in the ambulance.
I believe the records indicate that he had a lot of vomit in his airways in the ambulance and that he was vomiting in the ambulance.
And then in addition, we look at the earlier potential for aspiration, right? And you had noted that right after he was wearing the mask during the struggle, he was conscious, right?
I believe after the first vomiting episode, he was conscious and saying, "I'm sorry, I'm sorry."
And I was just going to say, you actually can hear him speaking, right?
That's correct.
And in your medical opinion or your expert opinion, based on him talking and being alert and conscious, he would have been able to protect his airway.
I would say if you're speaking clearly and he wasn't coughing violently, his airway seemed to be pretty intact at that point.
In terms of this carotid hold, the carotid hold did not cause death. Do you agree with that?
Certainly not directly, and I don't believe it would have contributed really too much hypoxia or lactic acidosis in that when you apply it, you're basically the crook of your inner part of your elbow is protecting the airway, so you can still breathe and get blood to your whole body with oxygen in it. You're just clamping down on first the internal jugular veins and the carotids to prevent blood escaping your brain from the jugulars and getting into your brain from your carotids. His brain weighed about 1/50th of his total body weight. So yes, the carotid hold did make his brain hypoxic for the period that it was applied. When it was released, though, it seemed he gained consciousness early. So I don't see how the carotid hold itself would contribute significantly to full body hypoxia. What I can exclude is that some people who are put in a carotid hold will get nauseated. And if that contributed to his vomiting while restrained, and if he inhaled some of that vomit, that could have put him in a weakened state. In that indirect way, the carotid hold may have contributed.
So I just want to break that down so we understand. If the carotid hold caused vomiting, right?
That's step one, yes.
There's no evidence that it did. I'm asking him in his opinion, Your Honor.
Yeah, I thought that was framed as a question, but if you can answer, you can answer.
All I can say is that some people get nauseated and vomit after sleeper holds. I don't believe it's a very common thing, but it happens.
It's an uncommon thing, right?
I don't believe it's a very common thing. From what I understand, this is commonly used in martial arts competitions. And when I've watched the Olympics, I'm not seeing vomiting when it's applied. But once again, some people will vomit.
Well, and to that point, you're aware that it has been used a lot. I mean, there's studies, medical studies on carotid hold, right?
Yeah, I think one of the studies I saw was there were no deaths associated with 10,000 properly applied carotid holds, I believe in jiu-jitsu or one of the martial arts.
So when we come back to that first step, if it caused vomiting, in your opinion, we don't know that it caused the vomiting.
Correct.
Okay. If it caused the vomiting, which we do not know, then that may have contributed to hypoxia, right? Is that what I understood you saying earlier?
You missed a step.
Okay.
So if it caused him to vomit, the next if is if he aspirated vomit at that point as opposed to in the ambulance. If those two things happen, then perhaps it contributed to hypoxia.
Thank you so much. So after the first if, the second if is that if he vomited, second if is if he then aspirated some vomit, right?
Correct.
Which you have already said, in your opinion, we do not know, right?
Correct. I don't know when he aspirated, just that he did aspirate.
Okay. And then you said, then perhaps I think that could have led to a hypoxic state.
If it was a significant enough amount of vomit into his lungs and airways that could have resulted in hypoxia. I think if it was a lot of vomit in his airways, it would have resulted in hypoxia. On the other hand, if he had a lot of vomit in airways, I would expect violent coughing rather than apologies.
So there's actually a fourth if, which is, thank you for bearing with me. There's the if the hold caused him to vomit. Then secondly, if he aspirated the vomit. Then third, if the vomit was of a certain quantity. That also, in your opinion, we do not know.
Correct.
Then perhaps it could have led to a hypoxic state. Did I do it that time?
Correct. And if those things occurred and it did contribute to a hypoxic state or lactic acidosis, then that may have left him in a debilitated, weakened state such that the ketamine had more of an effect than it would have if he was not in that weakened state.
So understanding we have established that we don't know whether those first four ifs occurred. If we were to assume they did, then the final if is that it may have put him in a hypoxic state because we wouldn't even know that for sure, right? I mean, it's like,
Well, I mean, I guess the next if is, if he had some hypoxia and lactic acidosis from aspirating vomit during the restraint, the next thing I don't know is, would he have died from the ketamine alone, even if this never happened? If he was administered ketamine, let's say in an emergency room or by a physician, I mean, can this guy just not handle ketamine? I don't know if he needed to be in a debilitated state to die with this ketamine. I don't know if the ketamine would have just killed him by itself. I mean, I really hate saying I don't know. I'm very egotistical, and I don't know how to avoid the uncertainties of this case. I mean, the only thing I can say with a real degree of medical certainty about certain aspects of this case is that I'm uncertain.
I appreciate that, doctor. And that's a lot of ifs that we're asking or that I'm trying to string together to understand, right?
Yes.
Sustained.
So let's talk a little bit more about ketamine. This is a drug to which people can have very unpredictable reactions. Would you agree with that?
Yes.
It's a drug to which people can have very unpredictable reactions, even in a clinical setting, right?
There is some unpredictability. It's predominantly used for sedation, but it also can basically cause psychotic breaks in people.
But there's no way to eliminate risks with ketamine, in your opinion.
Well, I mean, I think ketamine's already been eliminated from EMS use, so I guess you're not going to have any reactions to it.
Well, ketamine can be potentially dangerous. Would you agree with that?
Yes, it can also be used as a drug of abuse.
In this case, we're trying to understand the link of any, or possible link, I should say, with any risks associated with struggle or restraints to the effects of ketamine. Is that a fair way to characterize what we've been discussing today?
I think what I was discussing was, I've got video evidence that he got ketamine and then he's basically dead within a few minutes in an ambulance. I've got evidence that he was physically restrained for a period of time prior to that, that he was looking worn out, but I don't have any injuries that would kill him. So basically, we are looking at, did the physical stress of the restraint, his adrenaline going, lactic acidosis, potential hypoxia, did that make him prone to dying from the ketamine? I don't know that. I guess the second question is, you don't get lactic acidosis unless you're physically struggling. So if he wasn't physically struggling, would have even been a situation where he could have had lactic acidosis. If he was just relaxed the whole time, there would be no lactic acidosis.
In terms of your ultimate opinion, Dr. Sina, and I have it noted, tell me if I misstate this in any way, ketamine toxicity following forcible restraint, right?
Right, complications of ketamine administration following forcible restraint is my cause of death.
And you have been very clear that the reason that you included following forcible restraint is that it is a factual statement, right?
Correct, the ketamine administration came after the forcible restraint.
You have been very clear that it was not your intention to say ketamine toxicity because of forcible restraint, right?
Correct, or in addition to forcible restraint. I worded it just simply as a statement of fact, because I don't know whether I would have worded it differently if I knew the forcible restraint contributed to death, and I would have made it homicide.
And you said this earlier, but I just want to make sure it's clear. Your testimony is that although there are questions about whether any kind of forcible restraint played any role in the cause of death, you, in your opinion, do not know that.
That would be accurate.
You are very confident that what killed Elijah McClain was ketamine.
Correct. I don't see a reason that he would not have survived had he not got the ketamine at that time.
You just have one moment.
Redirect.
Dr. Sina, you testified that you were confident that Mr. McClain, I believe, deteriorated rapidly after ketamine administration. Is that correct?
I thought that was at the very top of that pulmonologist on the page where you highlighted it. I thought that was his first line.
Sorry, I'm asking about your testimony. Was your opinion that he deteriorated rapidly after ketamine administration?
Yes, I agree. He deteriorated rapidly after ketamine administration.
Right. He was already highly deteriorated before the ketamine administration.
I think he was exhausted and not moving all that much right prior to the shot, but I don't know how sick he was.
One of those reasons being because you don't treat live patients.
Well, the bigger reason is I rely on lab values and there aren't any.
Exactly. You rely on lab values because you're a forensic pathologist, right?
That's one of the things I rely on when I determine cause and manner of death.
Right. You don't get to look at a patient who just walked into your exam room and start making an evaluation of that live person. You rely on lab results.
Correct. Lab results, microscopic analysis, what I can see with my eyes.
I mean, Mr. McClain was so deteriorated before the ketamine. Are you even confident that if I showed you a few second clip of him, that you would know whether it was before or after ketamine?
I would definitely recognize the picture on the gurney being different than he was before, but before you can't really see him all that well and that he's lying on the ground.
I'm talking about the period while he's restrained on the ground. He's restrained there for a minute or so before getting the ketamine in that same position and for a couple minutes after. You're not confident you could even tell the difference if I just picked 5 seconds at random and played him for you, whether he'd gotten ketamine or not.
Well, I mean, right before the ketamine, I think within a minute before they lifted up his sleeve and he moved, then I know after the ketamine, which is the next clear shot I have him on the gurney, he looked worse. So you're saying he was pretty deteriorated before the ketamine. I, I, based on what?
Lack of movement, for example.
So how are you using the word deteriorated?
That's a great question. So if somebody's in medical distress or they're weakened, there are a number of signs that they are not healthy, that they're sick, right?
Uh,
And Your Honor,
Response?
I think that the court has the discretion to govern when leading questions are appropriate, especially on redirect, and especially in the context of how this witness is called and his relationship to the different parties.
All right, well, the court cannot find based upon the testimony that he's an advocate for either party, so I'll let you ask non-leading questions at this point.
So if somebody's in respiratory distress,
mhm.
there may be physical signs, right? Or what physical signs might there be?
Respiratory distress could be, it depends on the degree of it. Minor stuff, you'd probably just relax and breathe through it. The more respiratory distress you have, you may have difficulty breathing, chest tightness, maybe some tingling in your fingers if you're getting a little hypoxic. As you get more respiratory distress, eventually you're going to lose consciousness. And if you go into respiratory arrest, you're going to die.
Okay. So somebody who was on the low end of that scale, they might not be moving much.
Somebody who's exhausted with some degree of respiratory distress probably would not be feeling great and may not be moving much.
Okay. Similarly to what they might look like after ketamine administration.
No, I think he looked much worse after the ketamine administration.
And you're talking about when he's on the gurney there?
Correct.
Now, one of the things that you talked about on cross was something about how you didn't see signs of physical injuries caused by the police that contributed to Mr. McClain's death. Are you specifically just referring to like broken bones, physical injuries, or are you including in that, acidosis, aspiration, all that stuff?
No, I'm including physical injuries because you can't really test for acidosis or hypoxia at autopsy.
Okay. So when you say no physical injuries, you're not saying that there's no evidence at all of these other things like aspiration, acidosis, or hypoxia. You're focused on broken bones, contusion, stuff like that?
I'm saying there is evidence of aspiration. That definitely happened. I could see that microscopically. There's also evidence of asthma, but there's not a lethal injury such as evidence of strangulation or an armbar crushing his trachea or a broken neck or broken ribs or intracranial injuries from his head being whacked. So none of the obvious physical signs that you'd see, killed him. I can't comment really on the lactic acidosis and hypoxia at autopsy because we can't test for it.
Sure. You were asked about whether there was any evidence that the carotid hold contributed to death. And your answer was interesting phrasing. There's no evidence the carotid hold itself. And then you started to explain how the follow-on effects from the carotid hold could potentially have effects. Can you explain to the jury what those follow-on effects might have been?
Yeah, I thought we did, but some people who have a carotid hold may get nauseated and may vomit. If they get nauseated and vomit, they may aspirate. If they aspirate enough, they may get hypoxic and be at risk for lactic acidosis. If they have severe hypoxia and severe lactic acidosis, maybe they couldn't hold up to this dose of ketamine.
Okay. Now you discussed briefly a study involving some Olympic athletes and mixed martial artists. I think you mentioned there were like 10,000 different carotid holds that have been applied in that context without it killing anybody. And you said that when the carotid hold was properly applied, it hadn't killed anybody. I mean, fair to say that the word properly applied is carrying an awful lot of water in that phrase there, isn't it?
Well, the studies reference properly applied. Any kind of hold on the neck, if improperly applied, can kill people. For example, if you put a carotid hold on wrong, and make it a cross arm bar, you can crush the trachea and kill somebody with that. I have seen that happen before. If you take a carotid hold and restrain a person for 3 or 4 minutes, so their brain's getting no blood for 3 or 4 minutes rather than 15 to 30 seconds, you can cause enough brain injury to kill a person. I think that may have happened in a train in New York recently. So if applied properly, the hold is applied anywhere from 10 to 15 to 30 seconds if you really need to, but most people go out in 10 to 15 seconds. You release it and they regain consciousness in 15 to 30 seconds, maybe a minute.
Well, properly applied, especially in, the mixed martial arts setting, that also means what happens after you release the hold, right? I mean, those people are allowed to sit up.
Objection, leading.
Are those people allowed to sit up?
As far as I know, once you recover from a submission in the mixed martial arts, you're allowed to sit up and recover.
Are mixed martial artists typically wearing masks when they are submitted in the carotid hold?
I would doubt it.
Is there usually a referee there who's like down on the mat, making sure as soon as somebody taps out that their hold is released?
That's my understanding, yes.
Are mixed martial artists handcuffed after they get the carotid hold applied to them?
As far as I know, no.
Mixed martial artists, are they typically held down by two cops after they've had the carotid hold applied to them?
I would say that would not be part of the tournament.
Are mixed martial artists typically pinned prone by a couple of cops after they have had the carotid hold applied to them?
I would severely doubt it.
And certainly you doubt that these mixed martial artists get injected with ketamine while they're being pinned down after having the carotid hold applied to them.
Yeah, I have not heard about a case of that.
When you've got a mixed martial artist who's competing, professionally, do you think that these people are prepared to be receiving the carotid hold?
Do you mean the person that is getting it put on them?
Yeah.
No, I don't think they want to get the carotid hold put on them.
Well, not want, but that's part of the sport, isn't it?
Well, actually, most of the literature is one of the other martial arts, not the mixed martial arts. I think it was jiu-jitsu, but I believe people who compete in sports where a carotid hold is part of the sport should understand that it's a possibility that it could be applied to them during the course of their fight.
Sure. Would it be fair to say that they probably got some experience in having it applied to them and how to protect themselves?
I mean, I can only speak to traditional wrestling. I mean, you're taught certain moves to get you out of a situation where someone's trying to put a move on you. So it wouldn't surprise me if there are moves to combat a sleeper hold.
And not even just defensive moves. They know they can tap out, right?
I believe that is part of the sports that we're referring to, is you can tap out if you're under duress.
I guess the point that I'm getting at, Dr. Sina, is that would you agree that a study of how the carotid hold is used in professional sports is just wildly different than what happened to Mr. McClain?
I would say the physiologic response that the body undergoes with a carotid hold, whether it's done in the police setting or a martial arts setting, is the same. You're still depriving your brain of oxygenated blood, causing the person to pass out, and then they should rapidly regain consciousness. That's all I'm referring to when I talk about these studies. I'm not talking about all the rest of it.
Sure, the immediate physiological response has some similarities, but the aftercare, totally different.
Well, I agree in this case, Mr. McClain was restrained well beyond the application of the carotid hold.
One of the last things I want to ask you about, Dr. Sina, is on cross-examination, I think you said you actually don't remember whether you reviewed Dr. Buther's original report. Is that correct?
I'm right, I really don't remember, but I easily could have.
But you do think that you reviewed all evidence you were provided in the case?
If it was provided to me at some point, I would have read it. So anything that I was given, I had looked at sometime over the past 4 years.
Okay. Everything you were provided, you would have looked at some point in time over the last 4 years?
Yes.
Okay, especially before you came to give sworn trial testimony, right?
Yes, but that doesn't mean I looked at everything just now. I've looked at it over the past 4 years.
Would you please show the witness page 106 of his testimony from a couple of weeks ago at a prior proceeding? And doctor, I'll focus your attention on lines 6 through 9. The question is, and you, did you review Dr. Buther's opinion? And your answer just a couple weeks ago was, I believe a long time ago. And he issued a supplemental report, which I only saw on my work computer this morning, so I didn't get to see it. So Dr. Senior, it's fair to say you did review Dr. Buther's initial report.
Correct. And when I pulled this up after my testimony last time, it looked like the same report. So maybe initially I received a supplemental report. When did he issue it?
So you're confident you reviewed Dr. Buther's initial 12-page report?
Yes, when it was given to me.
Okay, that would have been a few years ago.
Yes.
And then you realized there was a supplemental report that's only 2 pages long before your trial testimony a few weeks ago, right?
Right. And I glanced at that on my work computer.
I thought you said it in your prior sworn statement that you didn't get to see that.
No, I glanced on it on my work computer after that trial because I hadn't seen it for that trial.
Okay. Suffice to say, you don't remember any of the findings from it.
Other than even though his wording for agonal breathing is different than mine, he says that after the ketamine, he rapidly deteriorated. He's breathing shallowly and irregularly. I call that agonal breathing. What you showed me is he didn't call it agonal breathing, but the guy's in cardiac arrest 2 minutes later. So I think maybe we're using the word agonal breathing wrong, differently. I think death is imminent. He said agonal breathing means death is imminent, but at that point on the video, he doesn't see agonal breathing.
Sorry, Dr. Sina, I'm talking about the 2-page supplemental report that you just testified that you reviewed.
Yeah, I looked at that on my work computer after the last trial.
The word agonal isn't even in that report.
No, I was talking about agonal breathing from the other report.
Okay. And now, Dr. Sina, you said something on cross that I think a lot of us can probably resonate with in some ways. You said, I'm very egotistical.
Yes,
I don't like saying I don't know. Is
correct.
that fair? Sometimes when we're very egotistical, it's hard to admit that there's somebody else in our field who might know more than we do, is it?
Could be for somebody who's egotistical. I think most doctors and lawyers are egotistical.
Get no disagreement from me there, sir.
I mean, we all have to think we're the best at what we do to do our job as good as we can.
And sometimes when we're egotistical, we might disregard or not remember the opinions of some other specialist because we discount them.
That could be theoretically the case.
And not just theoretically, doctor. I mean, that does apply to you sometimes, right?
Sustain.
Does that apply to you, doctor?
Can you be more specific?
Do you remember Dr. Buther's conclusions from that supplemental report that you said you read a couple weeks ago?
Not really, no.
But that's all I have for you, doctor. I appreciate your time.
Thank you.
May the witness be excused?
Yes, sir.
All right, you may step down. Thank you.
Thank you, sir.
Do people have another witness available? All right, all right. I've mentioned this, not necessarily to this jury, but I guess what my observations would be is that at one point or another in my legal career, I've sat at that table and at that table and arranging witnesses is one of the more difficult parts. That's because you don't always know how long they're going to take or how short the testimony is going to be. But I can assure you that the attorneys in this case are working diligently to get the case to you in a timely fashion. But for today, we will break for the evening. Don't form or express any opinions or discuss the case even amongst yourselves. Do no independent research. Stay away from any press coverage about this case or this kind of case. If you could please be downstairs about the same time you were this morning, and we'll try to get started. Hopefully before 9 o'clock, but certainly by 9 o'clock. So have a nice evening. All right, the jurors have stepped out. Anything folks need to let me know about?
From us, thank you, Your Honor.
All right, we're off the record.